Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the new Samyang AF 75mm F1.8. This is a lens designed for Sony FE full-frame mirrorless, though because it is such a wonderfully compact and lightweight lens, it also is well worth consideration if you shoot Sony E-mount APS-C, where it has a focal length equivalent of 112.5 millimeters. So certainly a very useful focal length there as well. So today we're going to be doing the definitive review in which we break everything down in detail, build, handling, image quality, autofocus performance, all of those things. And so if you don't want kind of the long format review and you would prefer an overview, I would recommend that you take a look at the standard review instead, as it will hit the highlights, give you the conclusions without all the nitty-gritty. But today we're here for the nitty-gritty, and so I'm looking forward to jumping in and looking at this lens that continues in the series that Samyang refers to as their tiny series, to where they are creating high-quality optics, but in very compact packages. And by the way, just so you know, I'm filming on the lens right now, and so all throughout this, you can get a sense of its performance when it comes to video work. Now, of course, 75 millimeters is a very unique focal range, at least for modern photographers. And we've seen in the last few years maybe a little bit of a revival of some focal lengths that had kind of fallen out of favor, but in times past have been very popular. One of those is 28 millimeters. I've seen a number of high-end 28 millimeter lenses released in the last few years. And 75 millimeters was a very common portrait focal length, and obviously has been kind of replaced by the standard 85 millimeter. So we'll explore that a little bit today. Obviously, 75 millimeters gives you a little bit wider angle of view, and so in some ways it's a slightly more flexible focal length. But what it's going to give you, as opposed to a 50 millimeter lens, for example, is more compression of the background, thus ability to create greater bokeh. And so in many ways it's quite an appealing focal length for shooting portraits, and so we'll show you some portraits as a part of this. First of all, however, let's jump in and let's take a look at the overall build and handling. Okay, so let's take a look at this new little lens. So first of all, as you can see, it is wonderfully compact. And so, Samyang's series here of their, what they call their tiny series has really been a boon, I think, to photographers on Sony, just to give options that are good optically, but really compact. And so 18 millimeter, 45 millimeter, and then of course this new 75 millimeter. So as you can see, it's a little bit larger physically than the 45 millimeter, which itself is very similar to the 18 millimeter. But I mean, overall, you can definitely see the family resemblance. These are really, really compact lenses. Now we can see, if we compare to their 85 millimeter f1.4, we are talking about a completely different class of lens in terms of its size and dimensions. This lens really does remain very compact, even when compared to some smaller 85 millimeter options. Case in point is that this particular lens weighs 230 grams. That compares to 371 grams for the Sony FE 85 millimeter f1.8 and 452 grams for the Zeiss Batis 85 millimeter 1.8. And so that means that this lens is literally half the weight of the Batis. And so, I mean, really, really light overall, just a little over 8 ounces. And so, I mean, obviously you can carry this all day. You can pack it easily into, a backpack and not notice its weight. It takes up it's got a very small footprint. And so if portability is a concern for you, this new lens is a winner in that regard. Also, when it comes to overall length, this is only 65 millimeters in its length. That compares to 82 millimeters for the Sony and 92 millimeters for the Batis. And so again, we're really in a completely different class. That's only 2.72 inches in overall length. So really, really compact. Really common 58 millimeter front filter thread there. And so, I mean, obviously easy to find other lenses that use that, and of course an inexpensive filter size. Can focus down to 0.69 meters or 2.26 feet. And so there you have an average 0.13 times magnification. That's, in line with what you see on most 85 millimeter lenses, where the class leader is a 0.14 times. So, I mean, it's not an amazing figure, but certainly a useful one and a common one for this, basic focal length. Not that there are really any 75mm lenses to compare it to out there. So as you can see, the lens hood here is a little bit larger than that on the other two. You can hear that it bayonet really nice and tightly into place. I like that precision. It's not going to come off loose on you, even though there is no locking mechanism there. You know, the physical design of this lens is really, really nice. I am partial to the overall look and the red ring. For some reason, I'm partial to that. Coming from Sony or from Canon, I can't imagine why I like red rings, but anyway, it's a great look. And of course, the headline improvement here is the addition of the custom button here. And so what is very nice is that if you go into the lens station, you can actually switch up what is controlled by this. And so right now I've got it set up to where in mode 1, you can control aperture from here. And so it gives you essentially like an aperture ring, so you can give a quick twist if you want to change aperture in the field. I like that. And then the other thing is that if you go into mode 2, I've actually got it set up to where you automatically go to manual focus. And so it's really nice because none of these previous lenses of basically any of the Samyang AF lenses on Sony, none of them have had even an AF-MF switch. And so this gives you the equivalent of an AF-MF switch plus the ability to have a manual aperture ring. So, I mean, that's great, obviously. So it would be essentially like a declicked aperture. And so you can, as you can see here, change aperture during video. There is a little bit of a stepping process that takes place there. But I mean, this is a great step in the right direction for Samyang. Now, the only one of this particular series that I have seen that has weather sealing is the 85mm. There's no gasket here, no mention of internal seals. And so that is something to watch out for. Inside, you've got 9 rounded aperture blades, and you have an optical formula of 10 elements in 9 groups. Now, half of those elements are actually special elements, including 3 extra low dispersion elements and 2 high refractive elements, which help it to have a remarkably good optical performance for such an inexpensive and compact lens. So obviously very compact, and in fact considerably more compact even than the rather small already Sony FE 85mm f1.8, and as you saw, about half the weight of the Zeiss Batis 85mm f1.8. And so if you're looking for compact, this obviously is a winner in that regard. And so it's going to really travel along nicely. And of course, it's a piece of cake to take along the 18mm, 45mm, and now 75mm, and take up less size and weight than a zoom that would cover that kind of range. And so that's obviously an appealing option when it comes to using all of that. I should also note that it comes with a really nice little shelled case that is useful to have as well, because it's compact enough that you can actually bring it along. Now, when we look at the autofocus performance, this, like what has been typical of some of these newer Samyang lenses, is they are now employing linear type focus motors that are fast, smooth, and quiet. And so really good when it comes to focus speed. Focus pulls will come quietly and smoothly. I would say that, like I've seen with several of these Samyang lenses, that it's probably about a firmware update away from being exceptional when it comes to autofocus performance. Now, on my A9, when it came, for example, to shooting portraits, fantastic. IAF works great. I don't think that I missed a portrait shot. And so really good results when it came to shooting that or PET IAF. But in just kind of out general shooting in AFC mode, I noticed it more on my R3 than I did on the A9. But on my A7R3, I noticed more likely that there would be a little bit of micro pulsing as if in AFC mode as you went to take the shot. Now, ironically, a lot of this happened in the viewfinder, but the actual shots would be properly focused. And so it's like it doesn't quite stabilize as much as what I'd like to see. And again, I've seen this before prior to firmware updates on other Samyang lenses. My biggest complaint is when it comes to doing shots like what I'm doing right now. Now, obviously I can't see what's happening at the moment. I'll see it when I get to post. But I've shot a number of sequences like this already. And while I love the look of the footage, I have found that occasionally I will get a long kind of defocus sequence where just out of random, it seems like, the lens will just defocus. And so obviously it can be destructive to shooting video footage. And so I would like to see a firmware update for that. Now, obviously this is compatible with their lens station, and so that does give you some flexibility for that. And I will throw a link to the lens station in the description down below at B&H if you don't have one of those. It's worth having. For one thing, in this lens, you have the ability to tweak the performance of the custom switch on it, but also it gives you the ability to apply those firmware updates with, which can be crucial to getting the best performance. For example, the 75mm F1.4, it started off as a little bit rough in some of those edges when it came to autofocus. Now, after a few firmware updates, it's pretty much flawless in its performance, and actually ranked quite highly when I did my 6-way 85mm comparison, and it was actually number 2 on that list, right behind the Sony 85mm FE lens, and right up there with the G Master. And so I certainly know they have the capability to do that. We just need to see those firmware updates rolled out. So let's talk about image quality, and particularly for shooting portraits, kind of the main reason for this lens, as well as general purpose. So let's jump in and we'll take a look at that. All right, we'll start off by taking a look at vignette and distortion here. And so we'll toggle that off for a second so you can see just a tiny bit of pincushion distortion, which is actually typically good for portraits, a little bit slimming. But at such a mild degree that it's not really an issue. And then you can see a fairly pronounced amount of vignette with a good linear pattern coming towards the center. We'll take a quick look at corrections. Now this is a manual correction here because there isn't yet a profile. So you can see what I've done here is I've dialed in a -3 to do a little bit of correction for the pincushion distortion, which seems to have given us a good clean result. Probably even a hair better once a profile is available. Now, in terms of the actual amount of vignette, not a massive amount of vignette in total, but you can see that I've had to slide the midpoint basically all the way over to the left. And so that just tells you that it extends quite far into the frame. And so again, typically for portrait work, it's going to be a nicely linear type result that you probably wouldn't mind leaving this lens uncorrected. Frankly, I haven't seen a lot of need for real world correction. So taking a quick peek at just the overall performance here optically in terms of resolution and contrast, you can see from wide open that we actually have a good amount of resolution and contrast. There's a lot of fine details being rendered there. If we look over here in the Prime Minister's face, it's a really nice result. Just a lot of detail of all the little renders there. And I like this old Israeli bill because it has good contrast in this area, and you can see contrast looks quite good. I like this because just the way it positions moving out towards the edge of the frame. I like comparing this, the upper left and lower right corners, to see how much is being lost. So we go towards the edge, and you can see that it's holding up quite well here. Finally, moving down into this corner, we can see that the resolution pattern continues right off to where we're starting to lose some contrast right towards the very edge of the frame. Looking over here for a second, this is at a 2:1 pixel level, by the way, and so a very high degree of magnification. You can see that we have basically zero issue with any kind of lateral chromatic aberrations. So let's quickly look at how that plays out in the real world. These are handheld shots, but f1.8 wide open and then f5.6, a more typical landscape aperture. And so looking at infinity performance, so we can see first of all that center of the frame performance is really good. But you can see that at f5.6, contrast has increased, and so you can see just better acuity. All of like the the unique needles there are more finely rendered. Here that you can tell that they tend to kind of blur together a little bit. Here you can see a better acuity of those fine details. Now as we move off towards the edge, that difference is obviously more pronounced. You can see that we're losing contrast towards the edge of the frame, and the details we're not resolving as well. We can see at f5.6 we've got an edge-to-edge sharpness. We'll take a look at the other side. We can see that it's also an even performance, that it is really good on both sides of the frame. Here's another good example, also handheld, but in advantageous conditions. We're going to have any kind of motion blur affecting this. So what you can see is, again, the lens is good, wide open at infinity distance. However, there is a little bit of softness that is in there and a little lack of rendering of fine detail. Stop down, you can see that we have got a brilliantly sharp result with incredible contrast. So not a bad profile for a portrait-oriented lens. You can see the same kind of thing that we saw before. This is at an even further distance. And so, but you can see stop down, the lens is just, it's brilliantly sharp. At a medium distance, detail and contrast look really good at f1.8 in this shot. And of course they look better still at this is actually f6.3. So you can just see some increased contrast, and you can see looking off towards the edge that resolution is up. But overall, I mean, this is a profile that I'm actually quite, I think is excellent here, in that you're getting, you know, good sharpness at f1.8, good contrast, but then, you know, so for portrait work it's good, but it's not going to show every single pore. And then as you go and stop it on down, it develops that character of just being super sharp from corner to corner. So I'll just show you how it compares to the 85mm f1.4 from Samyang, which is just a really fantastic lens. It's probably my overall favorite lens from them. And so what we can see is, comparing f1.8 to 1.8, that the 75mm actually has a little bit better resolution in the center of the frame. The 85mm has a little bit better contrast. Just looking here, we can see that, you know, I do favor the 85mm just a little bit because it is delivering a little bit brighter image. But what we can see overall as far as detail at mid-frame is that the two lenses are quite similar. And if we move off into the corner, you can see a little bit of an advantage for the 85mm. Of course, it has the advantage of being stopped down a bit. But you can just see that it is, its sharpness goes right out to the edge. And if you look at this area through here, it's holding up and rendering those details better overall. Now, what's interesting is just a mild stop down to f2. If, you know, your object is to get greater contrast, stopping down to f2 does make a pretty obvious difference in terms of the overall brightness of the image and improved contrast. So, you know, that's obviously an easy factor to go for there. You can see here. So if your goal in a shot is just to get a little bit better overall sharpness and contrast, a mild stop down, just 1/3 a stop to f2, is going to provide a fair bit of that. So we can see stopping down, a full stop to f2.8, center of the frame performance has now become exceptional. Very, very good contrast, very, very good sharpness. Looking off here, you can see that this is actually quite a brilliant result at f2.8. That's extremely sharp. Details are all really nicely rendered. And as we look down here towards the edge, we can see now that our sharpness profile is going right out towards the corner of the frame. There's very little softening right to just into the extreme full frame corners. We can see that there is a little tiny bit of a lateral chromatic aberration that has come in, stopped down at f2.8, but still mild enough that you're not really going to notice it. So how does this compare to the 85mm? You can see in the center of the frame, both of these are very, very sharp at f2.8. You know, hard to say one necessarily sharper than the other. There might be a little bit more contrast here on the 85mm, but it's, you know, it's very, very close. Now, typically what you can see here, that a sign that I see start to show up, is that very high resolving lenses will start to show sometimes a little bit of a moire pattern in this particular bill. So you can see that both lenses are exhibiting a little bit of that, a little bit more on the 85mm, which tells me that it's probably resolving a little bit more detail. Now, the corner performance separates the two a little bit more. The 85mm is just, I mean, absolutely brilliant here in the corner. And stopping down to f5.6 gives you some better performance yet in terms of the overall contrast there. So what we can see at here at f1.8 wide open is that if we look at our longitudinal chromatic aberration scale here, we can see that longitudinal chromatic aberrations are quite well controlled. There's a little bit of purple and a tiny bit of green fringing, but very little of it. And we can see that we have very good contrast with only a tiny bit of aberrations there right at the, you know, the transition point here. And so overall we have, you know, pretty good looking contrast there. So a kind of a high contrast transition zone, we can see looking here that chromatic aberrations in the field are really not an issue. There's no attempt to correct here. And what you can see is just the mildest amount of a green fringing after the plane of focus here, but I mean, nothing to worry about at all. Now the trade-off for not being completely corrected for chromatic aberration is that it often helps with the bokeh. And that really is a strength for this lens. So looking at the circles themselves, while you can see some deformation towards the corners of the frame, it's fairly mild. It's still a fairly kind of oval shape, and so not too bad. You also see looking here that there's just, overall, this is a pretty smooth result, not a hard middle line. Stopping down here to f2.8, 9 rounded aperture blades. You can see just a little bit of the nonagonal shape, still very circular, and we can see that, you know, right towards the corners, shapes are shaping up pretty good. And then here at f2.8, you can see those blades a little bit more. The inner line starts to emerge a bit, but overall, this is a pretty good performance for a value lens. That actually translates well into real-world bokeh. You can see here at f1.8, it's beautiful, really. I mean, it's very soft. It's what we've got here is things that create circular highlights, and so this is why I kind of particularly chose this shot. So you can see as you stop down f3.2 here, you can see the circular shapes are resolving nicely. They're becoming more definite, but still at the same time, it's a pleasing looking shot, even with it stopped down. And as we can see, subject either f1.8 or 3.2 looks really crisp. So a quick series of real world results. This I think is beautiful, really. I mean, bokeh looks nice, and sharpness on the subject, fantastic. Nice delineation there. In this shot here also, we can see kind of bleeding away to the background at various focus distances. It's a good performance, and also really nice on the narrow plane of focus there. Everything bleeds away quite nicely. Here's another that I think is just kind of beautifully done. You know, these could be hard lines. Don't become distracting or anything. Very good resolution on the subject. It's a nice blend of sharpness and bokeh. Another example here, so you can see everything looks great there, plane of focus, and then out here everything looks really nice. This is also a lovely one. Shows the great color of the lens, and also again very crisp edges here and nice fade away to defocus. So let's look at a few portraits just to show how these things combine. And so here you can see this is obviously a portrait of me. You can see detail on the face is good, skin textures are resolved nicely, but then you can see overall the color is nice, the bokeh is nice here as well. Here's another shot, and so I've messed with the tone curve here a little bit to increase contrast in certain areas. But we can see the background is blurred out nicely, and then very nice sharpness on the subject here. This particular shot is on an A9. I actually meant to take the R3 and grab the A9 by accident for this portrait series, but you can see how everything looks nice. Here's also another wide open shot, and so you can see IAF is doing a good job. We've got good focus on those areas. Really pleasing looking background. Here's another kind of shot through some foreground objects, and so you can see both foreground and background bokeh, and then also detail on the subject's face. This is actually a surprisingly nice little budget portrait lens because the focal length is surprisingly flexible and still does a nice job of blurring out backgrounds. Let's talk about flare resistance for a moment. If we put the sun up in the corner, as you see here, kind of worst case scenario for these type lenses, you can see a mild bit of ghosting artifacts coming down, a little bit of localized veiling. Stopping down to f11, these become a little bit more pronounced. And so an okay, not exceptional performance. If I put the sun right out of the frame at the right position, it can cause some generalized veiling, which can be an artful look, kind of a loss of contrast look, which, again, if you don't like it, you don't have to put the sun there. Here's what you can do pretty easily to correct it with the dehaze filter in Lightroom or something similar. So finally, some real world examples if you use it on APS-C. And obviously the size of this and the focal length makes it a tempting option for APS-C. So we see that on APS-C, resolution and contrast holds up nicely here. This focal length is 112.5 millimeter equivalent, and so obviously a useful, still very useful on APS-C, flexible focal length. And you can see that everything, holds up nicely here. This is just out for a little bit of a rainy walk here. And so, I'm impressed with colors. I'm impressed with, basically everything here looks quite good. And so I like the flexibility there of this particular lens, even when used in this kind of setting. So overall, I'm actually really fond of what I'm seeing here in terms of the profile, sharpness profile, because what we've got is a lens that, yes, it is a little bit center weighted at wide apertures. Corners are okay, but not exceptional. Stopping down is when you get exceptional corner performance and sharpness across the frame. But what I do really like is the overall look for portraits. There's enough detail there that everything looks good. There's no loss of contrast. However, it's not so hyper sharp that all you see is the flaws in the face. So it's a nice portrait lens in that. And then of course it does have a really beautiful bokeh rendering that I think is a cut above what I would expect to see at this kind of price point. This is definitely a nicer looking bokeh than is standard, and certainly is very competitive than what you would see from either the Sony or the Batis 85mm lenses. Probably not as soft as Samyang's 85mm F1.4, which really has, out of the 85mm lenses that I've tested on Sony, it's actually my favorite for bokeh quality. And and then of course the GM is also very good. But you're also looking at a lens that is much more compact, much cheaper, and thus it's for what you're paying and the size of the lens, this is a great overall optical performance. And so I think they've done an awesome job with that. So of course the big question that people will ask with this lens is that why would I choose it over the Sony 85mm F1.8, which is a very fair question. That lens represents probably Sony's best price to performance ratio of the native Sony lenses. And it doesn't really have any glaring flaws to it. Certainly right now I would choose it over the Samyang for its overall autofocus stability, even though the Samyang is just as fast, just as quiet in terms of autofocus, but there's that little bit of degree of focus confidence that I've mentioned that where the Sony still is a cut above on that. At the same time, it should be noted that the Samyang is about 50% cheaper, at least in the US market, at $399 versus $599. So $400 versus $600, $200 to some people is a lot of money. And so I don't think that you're losing a whole lot by choosing the Samyang instead. There's also the consideration of the focal length. 75 millimeters is not 85 millimeters. And so some of you may find that, the incredibly compact size and then also that very appealing focal length is something that just works for you. And so it's worthy of consideration for that as well. And so, obviously the decision comes down to you, but I think we should all celebrate the fact that once again, Samyang has given us another option on Sony that really fulfills the mission of light. For those that prioritize compactness, portability on mirrorless, really it's Samyang that is helping to deliver lenses that achieve that vision, even more so than Sony itself. And so for that, I think we should all be very thankful. So once again, this Korean company has done a great job of producing a lens that I think should be at least in your consideration if you're looking for a lens somewhere around this focal length. I'm Dustin Abbott. Look in the description down below and you can find linkage both to my text review, also to the image gallery. There's lots of photos there if you want to check that out. Certainly worth a look. And then beyond that, there is buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. There's also linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.